Welcome to another conversation, another moment, another episode. So, if you guys haven't already, make sure to follow me on all socials at Jaxplex, especially on TikTok and Instagram. I'm going to be posting on those a lot more this year and on YouTube too. I'm going to start making a couple of videos that I've been meaning to make and haven't gotten around to make. And yeah, I'm just excited for this year. I'm trying to look at making clothes, making YouTube videos, and just expanding my content in a lot of different areas. So make sure to follow me on any social media platform, pretty much at Jaxplex. And this conversation is going to be a philosophical breakdown on the Holocaust, how it's affecting us now, how it affected him, his family, Jewish culture, and a lot of different facets in his life and in society in general, as we know it. If you tap on the episode and you scroll down, you should be able to reply or leave a voice message. I'd be more than happy to reply to your text messages and voice messages before I start the episode. And here's a voice message I actually got from the caller I talked to.
Yeah, for anyone else listening, I recently got into this podcast and I've just been going through the episodes, and there's a lot of other interesting ones, so definitely check it out.
Yo, Jackplex, answer the fucking phone, dude.
Hello.
Jack.
So, you are Jewish, and that's really interesting. I mean, like, just for so many reasons when it comes to my head right now. I think that anti-Semitism has so many different roots and reasons as to its existence, as goes with racism, colorism, and a lot of other things that are socially and culturally conditioned into people too, I believe. And I kind of want to hear from your perspective, in your opinion, what does anti-Semitism stem from?
Yeah, so I think it's been around for a long time, and at least in recent history, it seems to stem from kind of uneasy times when things are hard on everybody. I think it's people in power or whoever might be to blame, they tend to like to have a scapegoat. And I don't think they don't just do it with Jews, they do it with all different sorts of minorities. I think more recently, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but recently you kind of saw it with the protests in 2020, where the attention wasn't on how broken the system was for a lot of people. It was on, oh, well, look at all these violent rioters and BLM. I think there's a lot of ways where people can use like minority groups and stuff like that to kind of direct hatreds or anger towards just the system in general.
Absolutely. There's a certain truth, or an absolute truth, I'd say, that there is still prevailing forms of prejudice, whether it be through racism or anti-Semitism. And I think that the protests in 2020 definitely had some truth to it. But as you said before, the actual biggest issue, because you have to work from the ground up, right? Like the biggest issue is actually the system that we operate under, through our economic system, through our governmental system, through the way that we view our politicians and our leadership as a country, at least here in the West, in America. Yeah. Definitely, that's the root of the issue that we need to address first, and how this nation came to be in the first place, which, it was founded on violence. It's not a secret. I don't know, the first example, or like one of the most heinous things that comes to mind, is how normal it was in the 1960s for white people to go into local pools where black people were just, being themselves, enjoying themselves in pools, and white people would throw acid pools just to hurt black people because it was fun for them at the time. It's definitely sociopathic, the roots of this country. There's also a bigger issue too, where there's hyper-individualism, the general ideology on so many levels, I think, in the West. It's almost like it's designed to distract you from the root of the problem and work upwards from there. I certainly see what you're saying too with this prevailing notion of just kind of using scapegoats and using other things to draw attention away from the bigger problem.
I think a lot of times that's the simple answer too. So people, they don't want to acknowledge that it's a complex issue and it can take sometimes hundreds of years to undo certain damages that we have. And it's a lot easier to say, oh, it's all these Jews or all these black people or whoever. causing this issue, and it's a real specific, easy thing that we can fix. So I think that's like oversimplifying things can be dangerous in that way too.
And the first person that actually comes to mind when you say that is Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh was a right-wing talk show host. Actually, I think I'll just look up one of his quotes really quick. I mean, you probably wouldn't know Rush Limbaugh if you were in a blue state or really literally anywhere that is not probably in the Midwest, more probably wider areas.
Yeah, I'm semi-familiar with him just because of how he's well known for being bad. I'd say if people aren't familiar with him, you find one quote by him and that'll kind of sum it up.
Oh yeah, one quote that comes to mind that he said was, "When a gay person turns his back on you, it is anything but an insult. It's an invitation." Feminism was established so as to allow unattractive women access to the mainstream of society. He also said that the Earth's ecosystem is not fragile. Women should not be allowed on juries where the accused is a stud. The Los Angeles riots were not caused by the Rodney King verdict. The Los Angeles riots were caused by rioters. So many levels to this. There's another level to this too, because he had a huge following and he was saying these things that are incredibly oversimplified. And I think that this oversimplification not only has a huge part as to where we are today, and it continues to be in a current action that is still being taken today by our leadership, but it was also a huge tactic used by the Nazis back when Hitler had rose to power.
Yeah, so at least in Hitler's time, from what I've read about it, is that he disturbingly the same steps that you'll see with like US media and Western countries. It starts out where the people doing these hateful things, or the people inspired to do these hateful things, I don't think have this idea that I'm being hateful and I get joy out of it. I mean, there are some people like that too, but I think for the most part, you have to convince them that it's a worthy cause and that any kind of violence they perpetrate, they're willing to own it because they're proud of whatever goal they think they're working towards. That was kind of a big thing that Hitler did. You kind of see it on a smaller scale here, like with stuff Rush Limbaugh said, where he oversimplifies. Well, it's not the Rodney King verdict that caused the riot, it's the rioters. It's like, well, if you don't want people rioting, what's the best way to do that? It's to not have a faulty justice system, corrupt police, and all this stuff. So it's like people never really look at the cause. They always just look at the immediate reaction and say, oh, how do we stop that? Well, let's arrest all them or do whatever.
I also think that fear plays a huge part into this too. I think that a lot of people are just scared of the unknown. When you kind of consider like the level of conversation that we're having right now, as you're talking and as I'm talking, I'm thinking about so many different historical events that mean different things and show different patterns in human behavior. And I think a lot about good and evil and human nature. But the thing is that whenever I talk about this, I get so many different questions and so many different responses and causes to different events. And I think that this can be really overwhelming for people, a lot of people. And as you said before, that kind of conditioning that you can get and this oversimplification, I think, makes people have a sense of peace, actually. I think that people that are willing to kind of give in to that and people that are kind of willing to just accept these ideas, is it fair to call their critical thinking skills weak? Or what would you say about that?
I think to some extent you could say it's weak, but at the same time, you have to look at the population of Germany before that time. They were kind of known as this liberal, progressive country where, if you're a new artist trying experimental things, or anybody kind of in that world could go there and try things out. In a lot of ways, they were kind of a symbol of like progress and everything like that. And their citizens, for the most part, kind of reflected that.
Just want to throw in really quick, the philosophy that was coming out of Germany during the 19th century was insane too. Like education in Germany was top notch, top level. They were ahead of the curve in almost every sense too, that I want to add.
Yeah. So that kind of goes into it too, where I think it wasn't this kind of uneducated, backwards group of people where it happened. It was a pretty progressive, forward-thinking country. And I think if you can trick people into having the false facts, you kind of have to like construct a false reality, and then people can use their critical thinking skills, but all the pieces involved in it are bullshit. I think people who are really skilled in critical thinking and they can really think for themselves, a lot of those people kind of escape that ideology. But, I think most everyday people, it would be pretty easy to convince them of, obviously, unless you're Jewish or some other minority that's directly being affected. I think you can be given these false pieces of information that you're working with, and you feel like you're kind of constructing a complex view of how things are going, but in reality, all of the facts and stuff you're working with is just on shaky ground, or, not even true in a lot of cases.
As a Jewish person, in your experience, when we talk about Germany, we're talking about the way that media can be portrayed to kind of influence a society, really. How does that make you feel? Do you feel uncomfortable knowing that family members of yours in the past were direct victims of this? Do you feel angry?
There's been times in the past where I'm angry about it. It's hard to say. It's kind of a mixture of everything. I think it's mostly just worry, not even necessarily for Jewish people and this kind of thing happening again, but just seeing how easy it is for it to happen. And the fact that it's happened in other places since then. People aren't really educated on it, even if they know a lot about the Holocaust. You have like the genocide against the Armenians and all this other stuff where it seems like, I guess that's where my fear is not necessarily specifically it happening to Jewish people again and the exact same conditions coming up, but more so just being familiar with the Holocaust and knowing how easy it is for a modern country with just like normal people to flip like that in a matter of a couple of years.
There are actually 8 steps to genocide, and it begins with classification. And classification is making sure that you label differences between people. Then you have symbolization, making the people that are quote unquote different look different by giving them, if we're talking about how white people viewed black people back in the 1700s all the way till, really still now, you classified black people as blacks. You give them a symbol, which is their skin color, which they cannot change. Discrimination against them bit by bit. Gerrymandering. If anybody knows about the history of the SAT, you can look into that too. That's a huge thing. Dehumanization, giving them an official name. I think we all know what white people would call black people back in the day, again, still today. And then you have organizing against these people. Polarization through media, radio, Rush Limbaugh, once again, perfect example of this. Preparation, actually preparing some type of mobile unit to enact violence against people. Then you have the persecution, which is the actual final-ish steps of leading up to the genocide. Then you have extermination, which is actually getting rid of a group of people through multiple horrific ways. And then you have denial, which leads me into another question, and denial being the denial of the genocide that took place. As a Jewish person, how do you feel about people that deny the Holocaust?
I try to have charitability with people, even if they kind of they're starting to go down that rabbit hole. But that's one of those things that still really angers me, because it's like they don't have the courage to defend the ideology or what was done. They just pretend it never happened. I obviously dislike Nazis, but I would prefer that they're out in the open about it and they defend their beliefs and, they stand up for what they believe in, even if it's horrible, instead of this kind of I agree with Nazis, but any bad thing they did isn't true. I think that's a kind of specific point of anger for me with those people. Obviously, overall, just that they're denying the Holocaust, and it's such a well-documented event. That kind of goes into fears that we were talking about before, where it's like, if people so wholeheartedly believe something that they're able to just ignore one of the most well-documented events in history, that's pretty concerning too.
And again, you don't have to go into it too much, but I am very curious. Pretty common to hear of these things, tragedies at whatever level it may be. I had interviewed a man who actually survived the worst mass shooting in the United States history, and it was the Las Vegas. It's interesting how you can hear about these things, and you kind of get that feeling where it's like, oh wow, like this happened. But then when you talk to someone that had actually went through it, it's a completely different experience. And it kind of makes me wonder about you and your family, your grandparents, I don't think you have kids, but if you have any siblings that have kids and so on and so forth, how has this historical event kind of shaped and shifted your family?
I don't have kids, but I could go off of what I remember being told when I was younger. I'd say around like second or third grade, I started kind of asking questions. That's when they introduced the topic in school too, which I think for some people might think is too young, but if your family's directly involved and you're kind of looking for answers, I think it's good to have it done in a school setting where you can like process it as a class and everything. I think learning, even though in some ways it's necessary, I think learning about it at such a young age might alter your worldview in a pretty big way. They might be explained things in a more simple term, but you're not really getting the graphic imagery and everything like that. I think knowing about that from a super young age definitely made me more pessimistic just towards like the outcomes I see in the world and generally what I think people could be brought to. I think people can be brought to do much worse things than I think I would have if I didn't learn that at such a young age. Just generally, like, for our family's ideology, I think it really, and this is true for a lot of Jewish people, where I think that's what kind of kept them on the left wing politically, is just going through these types of things and maybe seeing it reflected in smaller ways after they survived and moved to the US or wherever. You could say the protests in 2020 as a recent example. I think a survivor who went through all that might look at it more charitably towards the people who were rioting, whereas somebody who has no experience with oppression or anything like that would just see it as, oh, they're doing property damage. I think it brought them over to the left politically and definitely socially as well.
When it comes to personal effects emotionally, how do your parents talk about it and your grandparents?
But it's interesting how, different personalities that were intact or not intact after the war kind of affected how they processed it. So one example, and I think it's a big part of it, is their experience specifically. So one good example would be my grandpa, who they were living in Poland at the time. And he had 8 siblings. And, the Nazis occupied the western half of Poland and the Russians took the eastern half. And luckily they were on the eastern half, so it was Russian-occupied Poland, but they had a family business on the German side of Poland. And there is this river that they were going to cross. My grandpa and his brother were going to cross to go work in the family business, kind of keep things going. And this was maybe a year or two before things really got into full swing, so it'd be like the early 40s. So it was this big river, pretty fast-moving water. My great uncle was more athletic, so he said, I'm going to swim across. And my grandpa was, not a strong swimmer, so he said, I'm going to find a smuggler and pay him. So he gets into the boat. He watches my great uncle swim across the river. He makes it across fine. Everything's good. My grandpa gets in the boat, and it's a Russian smuggler. And right as they're about to leave, the smuggler starts asking him questions. And I think my grandpa knew like 5 or 6 languages at the time. There were just a lot of, surrounding countries where he was traveling for work and stuff like that. So the smuggler assumed he was a spy, and he actually arrested him and brought him to a Russian gulag. The name of it was Arkhangelsk, if anyone wanted to look up the location. So for the majority of the Holocaust, he was in that Russian gulag. And obviously it's no fun being there, but he was fed and clothed and he had a heated shelter. And his brother, who made it across the river, that was the last time he ever saw him. So obviously a traumatic experience, but I think he didn't have that constant anxiety of having to run and hide and not knowing who to trust because he was in this camp for the whole time. Whereas my grandma, she got a fake ID. So she disguised herself as a Polish Catholic migrant worker. And she worked for this high up Nazi family as a housemaid and nanny.
Whoa, that's crazy.
So she was kind of right in the lion's den. It was a prominent political family. And the son kind of had a crush on her. So he was always following around and trying to talk to her and win her over and stuff. And she just never really talked about it. And I think that's part of the reason why is she had also the fact that my grandpa was in his early 20s when it started and my grandma was maybe 13. And she must have been 15 or 16 when she was this fake Catholic Polish maid for the Nazi family. A lot of the information from her I actually had to get from her niece. Her mom made it through the Holocaust, but they got separated after the war briefly. And my grandma kind of took care of her like a little sister. And she's quite a bit younger, so she's still around. And we visited her a few years ago, and she told us that this kid who had a crush on my grandma said, well, I don't like the Nazis, but the good part is they're getting rid of all these Jews. So, she's surrounded by people saying stuff like that. And certainly I'm sure a few people are going to be suspicious of you as a migrant worker. And I think that really shaped just like her personality and how she dealt with it afterwards. And we learned long after she died from her niece that high up Nazi's son actually raped her at one point. And that was just something she never told anybody besides the niece of hers. So she really never talked about anything. And my grandpa was the complete opposite. He liked to kind of retell the story and make it like a triumph and happy ending, I guess.
Is your grandfather still alive?
No. So my grandma passed away 2010 and he died in 2011. They had a lot of cousins and stuff like that. They had 3 cousins that lived here, and the last one died maybe 6 months ago. I think she was like 96 or 97. They all lived really long.
How does it make you feel to know that? I mean, we're coming up on a point where, I think maximum 2030, fortunately, every single last Holocaust survivor will have passed away. What kind of feeling does that bring you?
It feels like there's this clock ticking, and we only have a certain amount of time to collect all these stories, kind of pass them on to people. The bigger thing is, I think, even with people alive today that can go and speak to schools or groups or whoever, there's still people out there denying it. So what worries me is that when they pass away and they're denying it right now. And when you have these firsthand accounts dying in the next 10, 15 years, it's kind of concerning to think, how much more of an argument the deniers will feel like they have. I guess the main thing is just trying to get as many stories and counts as we can, because, like I said earlier, it's really dependent on each person and their experience. Kind of getting the different personalities and experiences to talk about what happened, I think, is super important.
I have a distinct memory. I think it was in 6th grade in my reading class, and we had to watch a movie on the Holocaust. That's why I like doing these conversations, because I think that I connect dots about myself as I make dots about the world. We had to watch this movie on the Holocaust. It didn't shy away. There are some things, some ideas, some historical concepts that you can't hide it. You can't make it seem less than what it was. And It had an emotional lead up. It was very real. I think it was about a girl and her sister. And I believe she had to actually, there are points where Nazis had Jewish people shoveling, making coffins or making space and holes for dead bodies. This particular girl, I'm not sure if the story was based in fact or not. I completely don't doubt that it was based in fact. She had to actually dig the grave for her sister, and the movie ended with her entering a gas chamber. I think that they had just moved away from shooting Jewish people to moving on to the gas chambers because that was more efficient, and it also caused less trauma for the Nazi soldiers that were shooting and killing Jewish people. It's also another interesting thing too, because by no means or any stretch of the imagination am I saying that being a Nazi is a good thing in any way, shape, or form. But what I would like to point out is that it's interesting how a lot of Nazis had to resort to heavy amounts of alcohol, heavy amounts of drugs, heavy methods of coping to deal with the violence that they were inflicting on people. And I think that in some part of them, they must have known, at least I would say some percentage of them, there was some notion that what they were doing was morally and ethically, in every sense, just wrong.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
It kind of reminded me of this book called Ordinary Men. And that's exactly what it's about. It's saying there's these kind of tame middle-class people who have families and normal jobs. How are they kind of turned into these monsters? It goes back to earlier where I say it's kind of made me a little more pessimistic, where you can have people that, I guess in this context, it's a weird thing to say, but at their heart, they could start out as good people, normal, just everyday people. They have a job, they have a family, whatever. And if you can get people like that to do this type of thing, I think that's where it might make me a little more pessimistic in my worldview. It is really interesting how these kind of like everyday people were made to do these things, and that it worked so successfully too. It wasn't a disaster. There weren't big groups of people refusing to do it or anything like that. It all went pretty smoothly.
What do you think of human nature? What do you make of it?
I don't like to put it too much into one category. I think a lot of it is people just trying to answer questions in their head. And again, like we were saying earlier, trying to oversimplify things and feel like they have a complete understanding of everything. And I think that alone just drives a lot of human nature, trying to understand things for better or for worse.
Do you think that if we made a ideological push of before I started recording, I said that I only know that I actually know nothing. The first person to say that, I believe, is actually Aristotle or Socrates. I could be wrong, honestly. Either one of them.
That was actually a favorite quote of my grandpa's. He would always say, if you think you know, then you don't know. And if you think you don't know, you already know a lot. Something like that. But, variation on the same idea.
Do you think that if this was an ideological push, do you think that'd make a difference? Because I really feel like that's actually a huge root of a lot of these problems. I think that people try to solve problems without critically thinking. Really, I mean, it's not taught. But this brings us to a whole other issue, which is how education is treated and how it's been treated throughout history. Why are we not taught about thinking? Why are we not taught about philosophy? Why are we not taught about critical race theory and theory in general? Why are we not taught about so many different things that I feel like would encapsulate a much more holistic and educated worldview and pattern of thinking, so much so that a lot of these issues would actually not be solved, but definitely mitigated in a much more useful and powerful way. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of education's been kind of ruined by making it about getting a job or being like marketable in our economy. Kind of these like deeper ideas get tossed aside. I don't know how we would fix that. It seems like a much bigger systemic issue where it's like, where do kids even have the time to learn these things if they're just being kind of trained to be thrown out in the world and be able to operate a machine or do whatever their job is. And, I'm not a huge conspiracy guy, but I think there is some truth to the idea that, I think it was like a George Carlin joke where he said like they want you just smart enough to run the cash register in the machines, but not smart enough to say, hey, this is bullshit. Let's like take this over, something like that. But I think there's some truth to that where it's like there's a kind of happy medium of education for the system to run well and for people to not cause too much of an issue.
I think that's absolutely true. I think it'd be facetious to not admit in some level that this is true. Imagine how difficult it would be for a government to have a population that is thinking on this level constantly. How difficult it'd be to begin this. I think this would probably cause a lot of riots, really. I mean, I think that if every person were to sit down and let's say that we all were able to speak the same language and we just conversed over a period of 1 to 2 weeks, I think that we would all learn so much more if we were just to sit and listen to each other, that it would cause a whole rewiring and rechanging of how everything actually works. I do think that there has to be some level of truth. Also, by the way, I love George Carlin. There has to be some level of truth to that. In international relations, it's also a very big idea that nation states are very focused on obtaining power in order to, just have regional and global influence to push whatever their national agenda is. Every country has some type of national agenda. And having a population that produces, specifically too under capitalism, a society that produces is a society that allows this influence, which is why the US has been so prominent. But with the rise of China and communism actually in the East right now, it's going to be really interesting to see how this unfolds in the next 10 to 20 years. I think that's also another big thing that's going to have significant repercussions soon to come.
Definitely. And, back to the education thing, I think you can have education just for education's sake. It doesn't need to always get you a better job or do something for you personally. I think just like kind of enriching your mind and knowing more about things. And if you do that on a big scale, I think people they would have more resistance to some of the garbage that's just allowed to go through Congress or, internationally too. I think if people realized how kind of screwed over we're getting, there'd be a lot more action on it and it wouldn't be happening as much as it does.
But yes, education for education's sake. This is like the most enriching. I mean, this is why libraries are so important, right? I mean, having a public area to have free access to education is paramount towards actually building yourself, your ego, your personality, your consciousness, literally as it is. Being able to learn about things just gives you such a better whole understanding of the world. I think that what really bothers me so much about a lot of takes, I guess, that people can have is how low effort a lot of ideas that are being pushed around right now are. I think that a lot of conversations that I see happening, maybe it's because I'm young, maybe it's because I'm 21 and I see it on my TikTok feed, Instagram feed, so on and so forth. But I think that social media in particular is actually a wonderful place to have discussions about the world and to enrich in our ideas and actually learn from each other alongside also, being a fun thing. I feel like the fun thing about it is being pushed quite a bit, which is, I mean, at the end of the day, like I said before, I mean, to have power, you need to produce. And people love fun things. So people are going to stay on the app longer if they see fun things and they don't have to think, because thinking takes effort, I think. And the longer you keep people on social media digesting fun things, is the more capital you can produce from this through advertisements, so paid posts, so on and so forth. The more fun stuff that you put out, though, it has a negative effect by allowing these ideas to be pushed. I don't even know. The first thing that comes to mind is Andrew Tate, for example.
Oh, yeah.
If you literally sit and think about like something that he says, any one of his ideas, and you sit and think about it for 5 minutes and you try to just play devil's advocate, even if you agree with him, I'm 95% sure that you will immediately see that a lot of what he says is facetious and that it's not an accurate portrayal or fair portrayal of how the world actually works.
It's like he packaged his ideas into a nice, simple thing for people to digest, and it's worked really well for him.
I will admit, I mean, at least in his case, I think that a lot of his followers are probably middle school, high school, and it's actually also kind of frightening. There's a lot of people that are in their mid-20s that think that Andrew Tate is smart or intelligent or has good things to say for some reason. That actually plays a huge role in how harmful this also has a huge effect on how, or shows how harmful masculinity and its idea can be for young men and men that are my age. I think that a lot of what he says is just old ideas repackaged and rebranded into a modern format. And it's insane.
That's kind of what you see with the Kanye West stuff, where I don't think people realize that, some of the stuff he's saying, and same with the kind of the right-wing coverage of the protests too. You can find these perfect parallels between what they said and what people were saying about like the marches in the 60s with Martin Luther King. The same justifications for like police violence, the same type of outlook towards the protesters. So yeah, I think a lot of stuff people don't realize is just kind of rehashed, updated for our time, and people fall into the same tricks.
I guess this makes me really believe that I think that a lot of human nature does have to be conditioned, right? For you to, a lot of it does have to be conditioned, and a lot of it does have to be shown to you from a young age. I think that a lot of people that perpetuate harmful ideologies have, to some degree, must have had them conditioned in them, either through bad personal experience or through family members, I would say, or their external environment.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think that's why you see such different reactions to like the trauma in my family based on just like their personality, but also the environment they're around and like the information they got and everything like that. It really, one good example would be my great uncle had a real bad experience during the Holocaust. And afterwards, this was a long time ago, we were having a Passover Seder. And for those of you who don't know, it's like a Passover is a pretty big holiday in Judaism. It's supposed to be when the Jews left Egypt. So you have a big dinner. Usually it's with extended family and everything like that. So we were over there for that. And I remember my grandpa and my great uncle were arguing. And my great uncle, after the war, kind of became an atheist. He became an engineer, really literal with everything. And he kind of said, humans are just these, like, I'm paraphrasing, but he said they're kind of just these bags of flesh with chemicals moving through them that are helping them make decisions. And then my grandpa on the opposite end was like, no, humans are important. We have souls, and kind of a more religious take on it. But also, I think, less pessimistic. And that directly relates to each of their experiences in childhood and their early 20s, and that stuck with them for the rest of their life. So I think environment, it really does affect who you are, and it's hard to undo it if it's affected you in a negative way.
Oftentimes I'll be on the phone with people, and I mean, as you know, sometimes I'll entertain some heavier topics, sometimes some lighter ones. I'd consider this one more philosophical more than anything, but it does remind me quite a bit about, sometimes I will be interviewing people that have went through things that are just heinous. For example, I'd interviewed a woman who was molested at the age of 2 by her stepfather, and then raped at the age of 6 until 13 by her stepfather. And she still, and the story's, I mean, it was over an hour long. It was a very long story, but at the end of it, she still said that she believes that pedophiles should be able to get help, and that humans still have some fundamental type of good, so to speak. I also remember somebody else who I'd interviewed who had grown up in Bosnia, which is.
Oh, I did see that interview. That was a really good one.
Yeah, you had heard what he said. He was diagnosed as a sociopath, and he didn't actually believe in a fundamental good in human nature. But as I think about it, I don't know. There's so much to this, right? Like, I can't.
Yeah, and I think that what was interesting that I noticed with he was from Bosnia, right?
Yes.
I think people from that region also, there's kind of this cultural ideology which tends to be more pessimistic, or I'm not able to think of another word other than that tonight. So generally that type of worldview, but at least that was very true with the kind of Eastern European parts of my family. It's almost like a joke that, oh yeah, they're Eastern European, they're going to be pessimistic. It was interesting to see that. I kind of saw that a little bit in his personality and the way he talked about things in a matter-of-fact way. Seemed, obviously part of it is the issues he personally faced, but it's also interesting how that can cross over with culture.
Absolutely. I find that, for example, I think a lot about Cuban people and how much struggle Cuban people have been through because of its interactions with the United States and socialism and communism, and how Cuban people are still, for the most part, I mean, I know other Hispanic people know Cubans get clowned on a lot, but they have a very easygoing culture. They're very boisterous, easygoing, funny people, actually, for the most part. And it's interesting how, once again, as you say, these cultural ideologies, how it does play a huge part in as to how these people respond to this. And that kind of leads me into, again, Jewish culture. How do you think Jewish culture has played a role in kind of processing the Holocaust?
Personally, I'm atheist, but I guess I would say I'm culturally Jewish, and I went to a Jewish grade school and, grew up around other Jews. So I think a lot of it is, like I talked about before, Jews are really into processing things through comedy and jokes. I think that's helped a little bit. That's been kind of a major point. And, you always have to be delicate with it. But yeah, I guess that's been a major thing, knowing other Jewish people and people whose family went through it. And Judaism's kind of always evolving as a religion. They like to fold in historical events and stuff like that into the faith. So the Holocaust was rolled in. It's called Yom HaShoah, and I think kind of mixing it with like certain religious philosophies that Judaism already established makes it easier to process in like a modern context. So I suppose that whole culture of like constant debate and editing and mulling over things and rewriting things, that's actually a lot of what the Talmud is just really, really old debates between different rabbis about the Torah. and what they think it is. So, you might have one page of the Talmud saying one thing, and then the next will be completely different because it's these two differing opinions. And that's kind of been a cultural tradition in Judaism for a long time. So I think having that like spirit of open discussion and debate can help people process it as a group better. And it also stops kind of one overarching narrative from dominating, and then you miss out on these other stories that aren't as well known.
Do you feel like in this conversation you have found some other perspective or level to look at it from?
Yeah, I think it's interesting just to talk to somebody who hasn't, they're outside of like the Jewish faith, kind of seeing even just like what your questions have been about it have been interesting, where it's more like philosophical conclusions that you can draw from it versus the actual event itself and things that went down. So I guess what I'm kind of taking away is just that I guess the value in telling the story is more the conclusions you can draw, certain things that you can better understand in the world as a result of understanding this event, more so than just knowing, on this day this happened and then it ended in 1945. So I guess that's kind of my takeaway.
What's really crazy to me? It's that everybody knows that one day we're gonna die, and our finite state of impermanence is ingrained in everybody's head. But I feel like even though we know it's going to happen, I think that a lot of people choose not to make some sort of conclusion out of that, or make some type of anything with it, really. I think that a lot of people live knowing that and choose not to think about it, or choose not to acknowledge it, or make some type of conclusion from it. But what's interesting about it is that, the fact that we're all going to die is already done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The Holocaust is already done, albeit, and I do wish with every ounce of my soul that I wish it didn't happen, but it did. There's only one thing to be done, and that thing to be done is to make some type of conclusion to elevate our understanding of our nature and see what we really are as a species. If I were looking at you right now, I'd want to not look at you as a human, but look at you as the energy that is, in your brain, the energy that has had all the experiences in your life and has all this knowledge. And I think that as a society, we would benefit so much more from being able to draw conclusions from things that are already done on a much deeper level, as opposed to just restating these events, if that makes sense.
And I think it's easy to draw just the conclusion of, oh, look what people are capable of. People are so easily manipulated and everything like that. But if you really want to put that knowledge to use in today's world, a big part of the lesson is like not feeling like it's some far removed evil villain story or something like that. Because it's, it wasn't very different of a society. People weren't radicalized really prior to that. So I think just kind of knowing what different signs of something like that happening are, and then applying it to today. And, this is going to probably, a lot of Jewish people would be disagreeing with this, but I think there's a big parallel in Palestine right now with what you're seeing the Israeli government doing, and it's obviously not on the same level, but, you can still draw similar conclusions and say, okay, how is it able to happen without like mass protests and people saying we're not putting up with this? And a lot of it is going back to what we said, like those oversimplified answers and people kind of taking the easy, non-critical thinking route. So I think that's another important thing, is like drawing conclusions and then also being able to recognize it in today's world.
The last question will probably be, if you had to give anybody advice about this who's listening right now, how would you tell them to approach life?
I would say, like we were saying before, just, don't ever think that you fully have something understood. There's always the chance that you're wrong, or you don't have the full picture. And, even if you feel like you've mastered a topic or an idea, just kind of keep your head open to new ideas, and don't be, I know people say like stay in the moment, but I think if you're in the moment too much, it's easy to get caught up in like these little things happening and not see the bigger picture. if there is something kind of heinous going on. Don't oversimplify things, or don't think that you have fully understood a topic. Because I think there's, even if you really have, basically, I think there's value in just the attitude of, well, I don't fully understand this, or I don't fully know this.